At exactly 7 in the morning, the silence of the Denver apartment was shattered by a voice that carried the sharpness of a blade. Helen Adams leaned over Rachel's bed and shrieked as if the world was on fire. 7 o'clock and you're still asleep? Get up and make me breakfast right now. Her words were so close, so loud, that Rachel jerked awake in an instant, heart pounding. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, until she saw the familiar ceiling of her own bedroom and realized what had just happened. Rachel had gone to bed at 4 a.m. after finishing another marathon of projects for her clients. Her job as a digital consultant demanded long hours at the computer, and though it left her exhausted, it also paid her 3 times more than what her husband Mark earned at his office job. But to Helen, none of that mattered. In her eyes, Rachel was lazy, unworthy, a wife who refused to perform the real duties of a woman: cooking, cleaning, serving. This wasn't the first time Rachel had woken up to the sound of Helen's accusations. For the past 3 weeks, Helen and Frank, Mark's parents, had been living in their 2-bedroom apartment. What was supposed to be a short visit had stretched into something endless. The air inside the apartment had grown heavier with every passing day, every complaint, every remark about how Rachel wasn't raised right. Their presence turned the home into a prison, a place Rachel dreaded waking up to. Helen's favorite topic was work. She refused to acknowledge Rachel's career as legitimate because it didn't require leaving the house every morning. No amount of explanation that Rachel spent 16 hours a day at her laptop managing accounts for corporations across the country made any difference. Helen dismissed it as playing on the computer, and every conversation circled back to the same accusation: Rachel didn't have a real job. Frank Adams wasn't much different. He had fewer words than his wife, but his criticisms landed just as harshly. He cared only for heavy, greasy meals, fried chicken, biscuits dripping with butter, bacon in mountains. Rachel, who preferred lighter, healthier dishes, often made grilled fish or vegetable pilaf. To Frank, that wasn't food. He would grunt from the kitchen table, pushing the plate away and saying she didn't know how to feed a man. "What kind of wife serves rabbit food?" he'd mutter. Every day since their arrival, Rachel had tried to endure. She told herself that losing her temper would only make things worse, that biting her tongue was the price of peace. But 3 weeks had worn her thin. She had given up her quiet mornings, her normal routine, and most of her sanity just to avoid another confrontation. Yet still, it wasn't enough. Helen seemed to believe it was her sacred duty to remind Rachel at every opportunity that she wasn't good enough, not as a wife, not as a homemaker, not as a woman. Now, standing over her bed, Helen crossed her arms and tapped her foot, eyes flashing with indignation. "I said get up. The apartment is a mess, and Mark will be home for lunch. His shirts aren't even ironed. What have you been doing all this time?" Her voice grew sharper with every word. Rachel sat up slowly, her head heavy from lack of sleep. She pressed her lips together, swallowing back the fury that rose in her chest. The truth was that she wanted to scream, to throw Helen out of the room, to remind her that she had no right to burst in like this. But she didn't. Not yet. She had learned to control her reactions, to breathe deeply until the moment passed. The thought flickered in her mind. This wasn't a home anymore, it was a battleground. And every morning felt like waking into another fight she hadn't chosen. Rachel's hands trembled as she pushed the blanket aside, not from fear, but from restraint. She knew she couldn't keep enduring this forever. For now, though, she said nothing. She let Helen storm out of the room, muttering insults under her breath, while Frank's voice drifted from the kitchen, demanding a breakfast that Rachel didn't even have the strength to cook. She closed her eyes for a second longer, steeling herself. She would hold it in for now, but the cracks were forming, and she could feel something inside her starting to shift. Helen wasn't finished. Storming out of the bedroom, she began a loud parade through the small Denver apartment, slamming doors, tugging at curtains, muttering about dust on the shelves that wasn't there. Drawers were yanked open and shut, chairs dragged across the floor, as if she were staging some domestic battlefield where only she could be the victor. The chaos wasn't about cleaning. It was about making a point, about proving that Rachel was, in Helen's eyes, a failure. From the kitchen came the sound of Frank's voice, thick with irritation. He had finally woken up, his hair mussed, his face still puffy with sleep. "What's going on out there? And where's breakfast? A man can't live on coffee and salads. You've got nothing ready." His tone carried the weight of expectation, as if a meal should simply appear before him without question. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, her patience splintering like glass under pressure. For 3 weeks she had listened, endured, swallowed her pride in the name of peace. But this morning, after being jolted awake and ridiculed, something inside her refused to stay silent. She walked into the living room, her face pale, but her voice sharp, steady. "Enough," she said, the word cutting through Helen's rambling. "You have 30 minutes to pack your things and leave my home." The room fell still for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Helen blinked, stunned that Rachel dared to speak with such finality. Then her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "You're home? Don't flatter yourself, Rachel. This is Mark's apartment. You don't get to throw me out of my son's place. You are nothing here." Frank gave a satisfied grunt of agreement from the kitchen. "Exactly. Don't forget whose name is on the family. You'd be nowhere without him." Rachel felt her hands clench at her sides, the fury hot in her chest. She stepped closer, her voice low but unshakable. "This apartment was bought with our savings, and we're still paying the mortgage together. Your son couldn't have done it alone. Don't pretend you helped us. You didn't give a single dollar. So don't stand here and act like I'm living in some gift you handed down." Helen's face flushed red, her indignation flaring brighter than ever. "All you think about is money. That's all you care about. You're ungrateful, selfish," Rachel cut her off. "I think about fairness. And I'm telling you both. You are guests here, nothing more. And I will not live another day under your insults." For a moment, silence pressed down on the room. Frank shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing more, while Helen's chest rose and fell with the weight of her outrage. She looked ready to explode again, but Rachel had already turned away, her decision made. Inside, Rachel knew she couldn't win this war alone. Mark wasn't home yet, and facing his parents without his presence was a battle stacked against her. They would twist her words, escalate until she was cornered. She could already hear Helen muttering under her breath, already feel Frank's disapproval radiating like heat from the kitchen. Rachel drew a breath, steadying herself. The confrontation wasn't over. It couldn't be, not with Helen and Frank so deeply entrenched in their righteousness. But she had drawn her line in the sand. And even if Mark chose to ignore it later, even if he tried to brush her off, Rachel knew she had taken the first real step. She had spoken her truth, and she would not be silenced again. As Helen continued pacing, slamming cabinet doors and tossing accusations into the air, Rachel quietly gathered her composure. She knew when to fight and when to step aside, and for now, retreat was the wiser choice. But she carried with her the certainty that this moment had changed something. The next time, she wouldn't just warn them. She would act. Rachel slipped into her jeans, tied her hair back in a messy knot, and grabbed her laptop bag. Without another word to Helen or Frank, she walked out of the apartment, the door shutting behind her with a firm thud that felt like a small act of liberation. The crisp Denver morning air stung her cheeks as she stepped outside, and for the first time all day, she was able to breathe without the suffocating weight of her in-laws pressing down on her chest. She found refuge in a corner booth of her favorite cafe downtown, a place where the warm hum of espresso machines and quiet chatter always seemed to calm her nerves. She ordered a black coffee and set up her laptop, determined to lose herself in work. If she couldn't find peace at home, She would carve it out here, among strangers and the steady rhythm of her own typing. For the first half hour, she managed to focus, sending out emails, reviewing reports, even beginning to feel the tightness in her chest ease. But the moment of quiet didn't last. Her phone began to buzz with a relentless stream of notifications. At first, she ignored it, unwilling to let Helen invade this space as well. But the vibrations grew too persistent. With a sigh, Rachel unlocked her phone and opened Facebook Messenger. The screen was flooded with messages from Helen, each more vicious than the last. The insults came one after another. Lazy, worthless, a disgrace. Some messages went further, dripping with venom, suggesting that Rachel didn't deserve to live in peace at all. One line in particular made her skin crawl. "You'll regret the day you crossed me. Maybe sooner than you think." Rachel stared at the words, a cold wave of disgust washing over her. Her stomach clenched, not out of fear, but from the sheer toxicity of it all. It was one thing to hurl insults in person. It was another to type them out, leave them in writing, deliberate and cruel. She felt a tremor in her hand as she scrolled, but her mind was already working. She took screenshots of every single message, careful not to miss a word. She saved them in a folder on her phone, labeling it with the date and time. If Helen wanted to play this game, Rachel would meet her with evidence. When the last screenshot was saved, she blocked Helen's number without hesitation. The silence that followed was instant, like slamming a window shut on a storm. Rachel leaned back in her chair, the coffee cooling on the table beside her. The cafe's hum carried on around her, a stark contrast to the ugliness she had just witnessed on her screen. She felt drained, her body heavy with fatigue. She had worked until 4 a.m, been jolted awake by screams, and now endured a barrage of abuse from a woman who seemed determined to break her. Still, amid the exhaustion, a quiet realization was taking root. This wasn't just a bad morning. This wasn't a string of unlucky days. This was her life with Helen and Frank under her roof, and with Mark refusing to intervene. It was an environment soaked in hostility, one where she was expected to endure endless humiliation simply to keep the peace. She unlocked her phone again, this time not to read, but to act. She attached the screenshots in a message to Mark, typing slowly, her words deliberate. "I'm at the cafe downtown. We need to talk. Come here tonight." She hit send and placed the phone face down on the table, shutting her eyes for a moment. The fatigue seeped deep into her bones. But so did something else, clarity. Rachel could no longer lie to herself. She couldn't call this temporary or harmless. The truth was unavoidable. She could not live another day in that toxic space and still recognize herself. By the time the sun dipped behind the Rockies and the streets of Denver glowed with the pale orange of early evening, Rachel was still at the cafe. Her coffee had long gone cold, and her laptop sat closed in her bag. She hadn't been working for hours, just waiting. At 6 o'clock sharp, the bell above the cafe door chimed and Mark walked in. He looked tired, but not in the way she was. His exhaustion came laced with irritation, as if simply being asked to show up was an inconvenience. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on her. With a heavy sigh, he slid into the booth across from her, his expression already stormy. "So," he began without greeting, "what did you and Mom fight about this time?" His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory, weary, as though she were the problem he had been forced to deal with. Rachel sat upright, her voice calm but resolute. "Mark, this isn't just another fight. I want your parents to leave. Tonight. I can't live like this anymore." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms, his jaw tightening. "Rachel, you're exaggerating. Mom's blood pressure has been all over the place. She's sick, you know that. Dad's stressed out. They don't mean everything they say. And now you're pushing me to throw them out? Do you want me to just abandon them?" Her chest tightened at his words, not because they surprised her, but because they were exactly what she feared. He wasn't just failing to defend her. He was taking his mother's side, justifying her cruelty. "I'm not asking you to abandon them," Rachel said carefully. "I'm asking you to draw a boundary. They've insulted me, they've invaded our home, and you've done nothing to stop it. If you want to support them, rent them their own place. Visit as much as you want, but they can't stay in our apartment any longer." Mark's eyes hardened. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "This is my home too. I have just as much right as you do to invite my parents to stay. You don't get to dictate who I let through that door." The final thread of restraint inside her snapped. Rachel felt heat rise to her face, but her voice emerged steady, unwavering. "Then listen to me, carefully. If they don't leave, I will. And if I leave, Mark, I won't be coming back. I will file for divorce." His mouth opened, then closed, caught off guard by the weight of her words. "Are you serious right now? You're making me choose between my family and my wife? Do you even hear yourself?" Rachel held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "You're wrong. I'm not asking you to choose between them and me. I'm asking you to respect me enough to not force me into a hostile environment every single day. I'm asking for the bare minimum, to feel safe in my own home. If you can't give me that, then what exactly do I have left in this marriage?" Mark stared at her, his eyes narrowing, his lips pressed into a thin line. His silence told her everything. He wasn't weighing her words. He was calculating how to push her back into submission. The moment stretched long, the air between them thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Rachel realized then, with a clarity that cut deep, that this wasn't about Helen or Frank or even the constant insults. This was about Mark. He didn't want to protect her. He wanted her to bend, to shrink herself until she fit into the role his parents had carved out for her. Her hands were steady now, the fear, the hesitation, gone. She had drawn her line, and she knew she wouldn't step back. The marriage wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a test of endurance she no longer wished to take. Rachel stood, slipping her bag over her shoulder, her voice calm but final. "Think about what I said. Either they leave or I do. But if I walk out, it's not just for tonight. It's for good." She left him sitting there in the booth, silent, the reflection of the cafe's neon lights flickering across his face. For the first time since this nightmare began, Rachel felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She understood the truth now. Her marriage had already cracked beyond repair. Mark didn't want to stand beside her. He wanted her to bow her head, and Rachel Adams was done bowing. Mark tried to recover from her ultimatum, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. "Look, Rachel, let's not blow this up. They'll only stay another week, maybe less. Mom just needs to get back on her feet. Dad will calm down. Can't you just hold on a little longer?" His words were meant to soothe, but to Rachel they sounded hollow. For 3 weeks she had endured, telling herself each day would be the last, and every time the intrusion grew worse. She had learned something the hard way. With Helen and Frank, there was never just one more week. Rachel folded her hands on the table, her tone even. "No, Mark, I'm not waiting one more week or one more day. I'm leaving. Tomorrow I'll come back for my things." Mark blinked, his expression tightening, as though he hadn't expected her to stay so calm. "You're really going to walk out? Over this?" Rachel nodded, steady. "Yes, because this isn't about them anymore, it's about you. You refuse to set boundaries. You refuse to protect me in my own home. That means I have to protect myself." Mark leaned forward, frustration creeping into his voice. "So what, you're going to throw away our marriage? Over a couple of arguments with my parents? That's crazy." Her voice sharpened, though it never rose. "It's not a couple of arguments, Mark. It's a pattern. 3 weeks of humiliation. 3 weeks of silence from you. I won't keep living like this." She paused, then continued, deliberate and precise. "And don't forget, this apartment is marital property. It belongs to both of us. If you want to keep it, you're still responsible for half the mortgage. You can't just let me walk away and pretend it's yours alone." That struck him. He stiffened, his jaw clenching. "So you're already talking about dividing assets? That fast?" Rachel held his gaze. "I have to, because I can see exactly where this is headed. I'm done waiting for things to get better when they never do." For a moment, Mark seemed to struggle between anger and disbelief, as if he thought she would eventually cave like always. But this time, there was no hesitation in her eyes. Rachel rose from her seat, slipping the strap of her bag over her shoulder. Her movements were slow, deliberate, but her heart no longer trembled. She felt the weight of finality pressing down on her, but beneath it was something lighter, a quiet resolve she hadn't felt in years. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "I'll collect my things. I'll call an attorney. You'll hear from me about the divorce. And if you decide to keep this place, then remember, you'll be paying your share. Every month." Mark opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. He only sat there, staring, his face shifting between fury and fear. Rachel didn't wait for him to recover. She turned and walked out of the cafe into the cool Denver night. The city lights reflected in the glass windows, sharp and unyielding, like her own decision. For the first time in a long time, her steps felt firm, her back straight. She wasn't leaving in defeat. She was leaving with purpose. This was the point of no return. She knew it as she crossed the street, her bag pressed to her side. There would be no reconciliation, no pretending that things could go back to the way they were. The marriage had been fractured too deeply, and Mark had made his choice clear. He wanted obedience, not partnership. Rachel Adams was done giving him either. The divorce itself was finalized relatively quickly, but what followed was far from simple. The issue of the Denver apartment became a battle that stretched on for months. The court reviewed the finances carefully and determined what Rachel already knew would be the outcome. The apartment had been purchased during the marriage, with joint savings and a mortgage in both their names. That made it marital property. It was to be split evenly, with each holding 50% ownership and both remaining equally responsible for the mortgage payments. Rachel didn't fight that ruling. She understood it was the most practical path forward. What she could no longer tolerate was living under the same roof as Mark, or worse, his parents. So she found herself a small studio across town, a place where she could breathe without the constant intrusion of Helen's voice or Frank's disapproving glare. It wasn't large, but it was hers, quiet and filled only with her own things. Even after moving out, she maintained her 50% ownership of the apartment, determined not to surrender her rights. Mark stayed in the apartment, choosing to live in the larger space rather than downsizing. At first, he paid his share of the mortgage dutifully, though not without grumbling about the costs. But as weeks turned into months, his discipline faltered. Bills piled up, deadlines passed. Rachel kept up with her half, sending in her portion of the payment on time every month. But she watched as Mark began slipping behind. The pattern became clear quickly. He wasn't managing. Whether it was poor budgeting, pride that kept him from asking for help, or simply his parents encouraging him to focus on anything but responsibility, the result was the same. Notices started arriving in the mail. The bank's patience was not endless. Rachel, meanwhile, focused on her work. Her projects flourished, her income grew, and her life in the studio, though modest, gave her the stability she craved. But she could see the storm gathering around the apartment. And though Mark might have thought he could let the debt slide, Rachel knew better. The mortgage was a legal tether binding them together, and his failures could easily drag her down too. The tension between them didn't fade after the divorce decree was signed. It simply shifted from personal arguments to financial standoffs. Rachel reminded him more than once that he was still responsible, that neglecting payments would have consequences for them both. But her warnings seemed to fall on deaf ears. Mark insisted he could handle it, yet the overdue notices told a different story. It was a bitter irony. He had fought so fiercely to keep his parents in that apartment, to claim it as his domain. Yet when given the chance to hold it on his own, he began to lose his grip. For Rachel, it was frustrating but not surprising. She had seen the cracks in his character long before the court put anything in writing. Now, living on her own, Rachel carried no illusions about reconciliation. The marriage was over, the love gone, and the apartment was no longer a home. It was a liability, a shared weight she wanted to shed. She was patient, but she also knew an opportunity was coming. If Mark couldn't keep up with his share, the bank would intervene. And when that happened, Rachel intended to be ready. Months dragged on, and the warning letters from the bank grew more urgent. Mark had stopped making his payments entirely. Rachel kept covering her share, but a mortgage didn't work like that. When one owner defaulted, both were at risk. The late fees mounted, and eventually the inevitable happened. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Rachel received the notice with a sinking feeling, but she didn't let panic take hold. Instead, she acted quickly. She scheduled a meeting with the bank's representatives, walking into the office with a folder of documents in her hands, proof of her consistent payments, records of her income, and the screenshots of correspondence showing Mark's neglect. She sat across from the loan officer, calm but firm. "I want to resolve this," she told them. "I'm prepared to cover the arrears, bring the loan current, and assume the responsibility myself. But I'll need full ownership. You know as well as I do that Mark isn't paying and won't. Let me take this off your books cleanly." The negotiation was tense but short. The bank didn't want a foreclosure dragging through the courts. It was costly and time-consuming. Rachel's offer was the simplest solution. She agreed to pay the outstanding balance and restructure the mortgage under her name alone. Mark's share, once valued at 50%, was reduced significantly because of the delinquency. In effect, Rachel bought him out for far less than the property's worth. When Mark found out, he exploded. He stormed into her messages, accusing her of trickery, of betrayal. He filed a lawsuit, claiming she had maneuvered behind his back. But the court dismissed his complaint swiftly. Everything Rachel had done was above board, documented, and entirely legal. She had given the bank money it was owed, and in return, she had secured what was rightfully hers. Helen and Frank were no quieter. They called, they wrote, they even showed up once at the building, shouting in the lobby about how their family's home had been stolen. But the truth was undeniable. They had no legal standing. Their names had never been on the deed, never on the mortgage. All they had were their voices, and now, even those couldn't touch her. Rachel stood in the apartment not long after the paperwork was finalized, a new set of keys warm in her hand. The rooms were quiet, the air still. For the first time in months, there was no shouting, no judgment, no weight pressing down on her shoulders. The place that had been a battleground was now hers alone. She walked slowly from room to room, her fingers brushing the walls. She remembered every insult thrown in these spaces. Every night she had cried herself to sleep. Every morning she had been jolted awake by Helen's scorn. But none of that mattered anymore. The apartment no longer carried the power of those memories. It carried her victory. Mark had tried to make her bend, to break her. His parents had tried to strip her of dignity. In the end, all three of them were left with nothing but bitterness. Rachel, on the other hand, had reclaimed more than just a property. She had reclaimed her independence, her peace, her future. The ink on the bank's agreement was still fresh, but Rachel already felt a weight lift from her chest. The apartment that had once symbolized control now marked the end of her oppression. Standing in the silence, she realized it was more than just real estate. It was proof that she had endured, fought back, and won. Rachel Adams was no longer a woman cornered by her in-laws or abandoned by her husband. She was the sole owner of her home, free from the chains of their demands. The marriage was over, the battles finished, and for the first time in years, the war inside those walls had truly ended. In the months that followed, Rachel poured herself into her work. Without the daily chaos of Helen and Frank in her space, without the constant tension of waiting for Mark to turn on her, her focus sharpened. Projects that once felt draining now energized her. She took on new clients, expanded her portfolio, and slowly built a financial cushion that made her feel secure in a way she never had before. The studio apartment she had rented remained her refuge, quiet and uncluttered, but she often returned to the larger condo she now fully owned, savoring the silence of its rooms. For the first time in years, the space belonged to her, and only her. Her spirit began to heal. The exhaustion that had once been constant started to lift, replaced by a steadier kind of strength. She went for long walks in the crisp Colorado air, spent afternoons in cafes by choice rather than desperation, and even rediscovered hobbies she had abandoned during her marriage. Slowly, the weight of those years pressed less on her shoulders. It was during this season of renewal that she met Daniel Cooper. Their paths crossed at a networking event downtown. He was a project manager in a local tech firm, confident but not arrogant, approachable in a way that put her at ease. Their first conversation was simple, about work and favorite hiking spots near Boulder. But there was something in his eyes, a steadiness that Rachel hadn't realized she had been searching for. They began meeting for coffee, then dinners. Daniel never pushed, never demanded. He listened. He respected her boundaries. When she spoke about her past, he didn't minimize it or change the subject. He simply acknowledged it, and in doing so, helped her feel understood. It was a sharp contrast to the dismissiveness she had endured for years. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. Daniel admired Rachel's independence, but also reminded her she didn't have to carry everything alone. He showed up when he said he would. He called when he promised. He valued her career, not as a hobby, but as a real accomplishment. Slowly, Rachel allowed herself to trust again. Eventually, the day came when they decided to live together. The irony wasn't lost on Rachel when Daniel suggested moving into her condo, the very place that had once symbolized pain, battles, and betrayal. At first she hesitated, remembering the screaming matches, the slammed doors, the venomous words. But as she stood in those rooms beside Daniel, she realized the apartment had transformed. It wasn't haunted anymore. It was ready to become a home. They moved in together one crisp autumn weekend. Boxes piled in the living room, laughter echoing down the hallway as they argued playfully over where to put the bookshelves. That night, as they sat on the couch surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, Rachel looked around and felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. She thought back to the long road that had led her here, the insults, the betrayals, the courtroom battles, the lonely nights in a rented studio. None of it had been easy, but it had carried her to this moment. Divorce, she realized, hadn't been a failure. It had been the doorway to freedom. Now, with Daniel's hand resting warmly over hers, she could see the future clearly. A life built not on endurance or compromise, but on mutual respect and quiet love. The condo was no longer a battlefield. It was the foundation of a new beginning. As evenings settled over Denver, Rachel leaned back against Daniel, her eyes tracing the city lights through the window. The apartment was filled not with shouting or judgment, but with the gentle hum of possibility. And in that stillness, Rachel knew the truth. She hadn't lost a marriage. She had gained herself, and in doing so, she had found a love worthy of the woman she had become.